Hello and welcome to Board Game Madness. I'm Mike Ganade, and we are here in round 2 of our tournament to find out the best games of my collection. And we have a matchup of roll and write games today. We have the number 10 seed, Cartographers, going up against the number 26 seed, Dinosaur Island Rawr and Write. So, really interesting that these two games happen to meet each other. It's two of my favorite roll and write games from my collection. Technically, Cartographers is a flip and write with cards where you're drawing a map of a fantasy land. And then Dinosaur Island Roll and Write does have those dice. You're rolling it and designing a Jurassic Park style dinosaur park by drawing different shaped facilities and setting up a tour throughout your theme park. If you want to hear more about what these games are about, please watch the previous round where these games triumphed over their competitor. In this round, I'm trying to not tread the same stuff and say the same stuff about these games, so I won't be covering the overview of what the games are about, and instead I'll be going through each section trying to cover sort of something slightly different that maybe I didn't catch up on the first time. So first up, we have production. And in this second round, I've been trying to call out my favorite component in each of these games. Let's start with Cartographers, because Cartographers has a lot less components in it. It basically has some cards, some pencils, and a map. And for this one, no particular component really stands out because, it's relatively simple. But I would say the map sheet where you're drawing your map is my favorite component because, it's about being a cartographer and it really invites you to draw on that map, and they have a lot of different map packs for variability if the basic maps in the core game aren't enough for you. So I'm going to go with the maps itself, the map sheets you write on. That's where you spend most of your time in the game and drawing on that, and that's certainly the main fun of this game for me. Now, Dinosaur Island Rawr and Write has two different sheets to draw on in this particular game, and while I do like the park sheet where you get to draw and design your park, I would say that my favorite component, or the nicest component in this, is definitely the DNA dice. They're these nice golden see-through dice with really cool genetic symbols on them of each DNA type, and they're a nice component, and they go in this felt bag and you pull them out and roll them. So it's a nice component. Now, as far as production goes between these two games, Cartographers is a cheaper price point game with less components in it. I mean, it has 100 map sheets, 41 cards, pencils, and a rulebook. That's it, reading the back. Whereas Rawr and Write has, your rulebook, your game board, 2 park sheet pads, a dice bag, 10 dice, 20 specialist cards, building cards, solo cards, season marker, first player marker, pencils, and custom dinosaur erasers. So, and with all that, while this box is a little bigger and it's a little more expensive, we're not talking about double the price here. We're talking about like $10. And I think for $10, Rawr and Write is giving you a lot more. And I think if you look at it on the table and, I think it's pretty easy to say that this production is better. It has some nicer, unique components you can't find anywhere else. Cartographers is a game that would be relatively easy to print and play if that was your thing. I mean, it's cards and the sheets. And, while I love the game, the components aren't what get you to play this game. It's the gameplay, in my opinion. So let's move on to game mechanics here. And the first thing for this, I'm trying to talk about some of the things that I don't like, or people don't like, or I've heard people don't like about each of these games. Let's start off with, player count. You can certainly play higher player counts with Cartographers. It says 1 to 100 players because, with the way you pass left and right, and you all use the same cards, you can play with a ton of people as long as you have enough pads to write on and map. So the flexibility of how many players this can play at is a really cool thing, whereas Dinosaur Island Rawr and Write is 1 to 4 players. That's what it was designed for. That's what the box says it is. Time-wise, they say these games are about the same amount of time. In my experience, this one runs a little bit longer. For whatever reason. Maybe I just haven't played at big enough player accounts for Cartographers. But I would say Cartographers is 30 minutes and Dinosaur Island Rawr and Wright's 45 minutes to an hour. It says 30 to 45, but in my experience, it's a little crunchier and runs a little longer than that. Certainly longer than Cartographers. So take that into consideration. As far as things I think people will and won't like about each game, Dinosaur Island is a lot crunchier game. It's going to be less accessible to common players. And while I don't think it's overly hard to learn, there is a lot more going on with it. You're managing 2 sheets, you're drafting dice. So it's not completely random, but if you draft a dice poorly or you're just learning, you can really get sort of behind the 8 ball on this one. And then there's there's a lot of stuff to manage, like the security of your park and making sure people aren't getting eaten and going after the different sort of point structures, making sure you're unlocking the employees and the special cards. There's a lot more going on in this game than Cartographers, and a lot more sort of variables for someone to compute to be competitive in it. So I think you need to take that into consideration. I do think that there's a couple, I think the rules, I think once you go through each phase, it isn't overly hard to teach, sort of piecemeal. But if you were to rule dump everything on somebody, it'd be like really overwhelming. But if you taught them phase by phase, I think it's relatively easy to teach. And the other thing I think people could say about Dinosaur Island Rawr and Wright, which I tend to feel a little bit, especially at bigger player counts, is like this game could overstay its welcome a little bit. Sometimes it feels like it goes on like one round too long. And especially if you have different skill levels, there's not a lot of ways for people to catch up, and you can sort of see who's winning and who's gonna win in that final round. Obviously the game made it through the first round is a game I really love. I'm just trying to be overly critical here and pick out some of the things that I could see people pointing out. Cartographers, again, I think all of its negativity, it's much simpler to play. It plays faster, in my opinion. I think the biggest thing that people may not like about Cartographers, and you could easily fix it by just removing those cards, but to take that nature of the monsters that raid your map, quote unquote, basically in the game, you can hit monsters and you pass your sheet to another player and they mess you up by drawing monsters on your map. And to take that nature of that, if you don't like, take that. And if you're playing against pretty ruthless people, they can really mess up your scoring opportunities and cause havoc on your sheet when you get it back. And that can feel bad when you're trying to work towards certain things and certain scoring opportunities. So I'd say that's probably the biggest negative thing that probably a lot of people or some people don't like. For me personally, I hate when a game doesn't have any player interaction. So I like, that particular negative thing, again, something some people may not like. That particular thing doesn't affect me strongly. And I think the excellence of the drawing mechanic and feeling like you're doing sort of like something other than a board game and drawing and creating is a really cool thing about Cartographers in general. The only other negative thing I would say about the game, I think, is that while this game has more rules to dump on you and more variables to calculate, I think Cartographers' scoring cards can be confusing just by looking at them. And I mean, luckily they've got pretty good examples on them, but you really need to spend time at the start of the game making sure everyone knows how to score all these objectives here. It's really not fair if someone misinterprets or doesn't quite understand how to score points on the different terrain types. It's really going to negatively impact them. So you almost have to take 10 minutes at the start of the game and walk through each scoring thing and make sure everyone understands it, everyone understands the examples, just so that they can make the best decisions as they're playing the game. I do think you almost need to hit pause unless you're playing with a really longtime player of the game and say, wait a second, this is how this one scores. Because I've seen times where people lost because they confused how the villages worked or something. And it was an honest mistake because you can't really look at the cards and tell exactly what's going on. You've got to almost read them and look at the examples. I do think they give good examples, but again, that with the take-knack, those are sort of the negatives, game mechanics-wise, about both of these games. If you were asked me sort of as a designer, like the things I would fix in either game, I think this is evident of which game I would pick to win game mechanics. When it comes to Cartographers, even with those negative things, the only thing I think you could look at maybe improving is the scoring cards and making them clearer. But if you take the time to read them, I do think they're pretty clear. Otherwise, I would change very little about Cartographers. I think I really like the game a lot. Dinosaur Island, nothing in particular stands out to me, like a glaring flaw that I would fix. But having played the game several times, I do wish there was some way it could be simplified a little bit. I'm not sure what that would be. Nothing is like striking me, and it's certainly a lot simpler than the other titles in the Dinosaur Island series, which I find way overly complex for what they need to be. But even this, I do feel like there's probably a rough spot or two that could have been sanded over in the phases to maybe make it a little simpler and more approachable to play. But it's just a feeling. I don't have an exact example. But for those reasons, I'm going to go with Cartographers for my favorite game mechanics, between these two roll and writes. I do really like both of them. I like roll and writes a lot. Cartographers for me is just like the pin. Both of these are up there in the genre, but Cartographer is just the way it has you doing the artwork I love, and I think that leads into theme. As far as theme goes, I love the idea of having a dinosaur theme park. I've bought and sold so many theme park dinosaur games, which I think I mentioned before, and this is the one that stayed in my collection a lot and fits that theme the best. But despite that, and I do think the game is overly thematic. I mean, you're rolling DNA dice to generate DNA, filling out your cryo storage, and then splicing dinosaurs together. Everything you're doing in the game is pretty thematic, even if it's represented by sort of drawing buildings on a grid. I do think it's pretty thematic. And Cartographers, while the Cartographers like fantasy realm that it takes place in, the role player universe it takes place in, I could take or leave it. I love the idea of being a cartographer. This could be any sort of region or land. This could be a city cartographer, right? Or a city planner where like I'm designing a city. But just the fact that I'm a cartographer and I'm literally drawing a map and I'm inserting this very creative drawing art piece into board games is just awesome. And I love that so much. And I think you can play Cartographers just to make a pretty map. Obviously if you can play to win and it's a game, but I think Cartographers as an activity to sit down and draw a map with other people is a cool thing to do. Without scoring involved in it at all. Just flipping the cards and drawing a map, filling it out completely, I think is a valid and enjoyable way to spend your time. You can't say the same thing about drawing the Tetramino pieces in the park of Dinosaur Island. Like, you need the game around that. Whereas Cartographers has this innate thematic map drawing thing, which I think is really cool. So this is pretty close because if you ask me which theme I really like better, I would definitely lean towards this as a theme. But Cartographers, when you take into account the actual drawing of the map fact and the fact the mechanics and theme are drawn so closely and well together, I have to give it to Cartographers. There's just no question. All right, that leads us to replayability. Replayability. Again, both of these games, I would say, this is tough because there's nothing in either of these games particularly that's going to mix up and drastically change your experience. Dinosaur Island mixed things up by changing out the special structures and the special employees you can hire. Otherwise, it's all based on your dice rolls. And while I do think different cards can set up different opportunities, I mean, it is a decent amount of replayability. It does give you a different puzzle each time. Cartographers does a similar thing. It sets out different scoring conditions. I mentioned those scoring cards before that you really have to understand how to play and learn. You're gonna have different amounts of time based on the seasons and the card flips of how many things you're actually drawing. And then, you know, in this, there's 2 different maps, front and back, that mix things up a little bit. And then there's a ton of map packs. I mean, I know we're taking into account sort of expansions, but this game's so cheap. You could buy the base game and like a map expansion, probably for the same price as I drop it, the same price as Dinosaur Island Rawr, right? So, you know, that's equal value, if you will. And I think those map packs with the scoring conditions the maps do play differently. And if you buy a separate map pack with a front and back of 2 more maps, they are going to feel a lot different than the base maps in this one. So, I don't know, it's really close. I'd probably call this as a tie. In the base games, I might lean a little bit towards Dinosaur Island, but when you're looking at like value, overall value or replayability and value, I would lean towards Cartographers. So, you know, I'm going to call this one a tie. I definitely feel very strongly that we're putting the right game through. Cartographers is, I've always thought of it as my favorite roll and write in the genre. And I think it maintains that and beats Dinosaur Island even in this head-to-head matchup. I mean, I really like drawing maps, basically is what it comes down to. I like drawing. It gives me more of a sense of drawing than Dinosaur Island does, where I'm just sort of filling out a grid. I'm actually, you know, if you get colored pencils on this one, you can have a really nice sort of arts and crafts experience. So Cartographers is going to move through to the next round. Dinosaur Island Roll and Write is a great roll and write. It's probably my second or third in the genre. Definitely probably my second if I don't include Merchants of Magic, the game we produced. So it's a great roll and write as well, but Cartographers is really something special. It's one of those games, like, I think I've gotten more per dollar out of this game than any other game in my collection. I mean, I've played it a bunch. I think I got it for like $20 on sale or at a convention. Like, it's like, for $20, the amount of hours and entertainment this has given me is fantastic. So, Cartographer is definitely moving through. We'll see how much further it can go. Thank you so much for watching this edition of Board Game Madness. As always, please remember to like and subscribe in this video. Let us know what you think in the comments. But we will see you in future videos as we continue to sort of count down and work towards our tournament of the best game of my collection. So, until then, we'll see you next time.